This video will show you how to solve for a missing angle in a right triangle. So before you were solving for a side, now you'll be solving for an angle. So if you look at this triangle, it's a right triangle, and there is an x on the inside, which means we're solving for the angle. So it says if x is inside, you have to use the inverse, which is what this little -1 here stands for. It just means the inverse. So these are the three formulas you're going to use. You're either going to use sine inverse. Remember, sine is opposite over hypotenuse. Or we're going to use cosine inverse, and cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. Or we're going to use tan inverse, which is opposite over adjacent. One other really important thing is that you have to make sure your calculator's in degrees, or you will get these all wrong. To use a calculator, I would just recommend going to Google and typing in calculator and using their calculator. When you use the Google calculator, the first thing you need to do is make sure that you have the degree darkened. So if you see right now, when I originally pull it up, it's not dark. So I need to click this button first. Once you do that once, it will stay in degrees while you're still on the page, so you shouldn't have to do it again. Second thing you should notice is if you look at your sine, cosine, and tan buttons, it's not the inverse. So you need to come over and click this button next, this inverse button. So you're going to click this second. You have to click this every single time you do a problem. So make sure you're always clicking the inverse. Once you click the inverse, these will pop up and show little -1s, and then you're in the right mode. So then say you're doing sine inverse, maybe you click this. On the calculator, it's going to show up like this. It's going to say arc sine. That just means sine inverse, and then you would type in your fraction. Maybe it's something like 5 divided by 8, and then you're going to click equals, and it will give you the answer. We'll do a few examples. Feel free to skip some if you don't need all of them, but you should notice on this triangle over here, I have this question mark on the inside. Since it's on the inside, I know I'm using the inverse. First thing I'm going to do is label my sides. So across from the angle I'm looking for is always the opposite. Across from the right angle is always the hypotenuse. Our third side we label adjacent. And looking at this triangle, I have opposite and hypotenuse. So I'm going to be using sine inverse. Opposite comes first in my formula, so it's 51 over 55. Remember, when you type this into the calculator on Google, you're going to hit that inverse button. Then you're going to click the sine inverse. And what will pop up in the box will say arc sine, which is the exact same thing as sine inverse. And then you're going to do 51 divided by 55. And then you're going to hit the equals. When you do that, if you're following along, you should get 68.01 degrees. For the second example, I'm going to follow the same steps. So I'm going to label across from the angle I'm looking for is opposite. Across from the right angle is hypotenuse. The third side is adjacent. Looking at this problem, I have hypotenuse and opposite. That's O and H. That means I'm using sine inverse. O comes first in the formula, so it goes on the top of the fraction. H goes in the denominator, so that's 27. When I type this in, I'm going to hit that inverse button. It's going to pop up as sine inverse. I'm going to press that. On the screen, I'll see that it says arc sine, which is the same as sine inverse. And then I'll do 19 divided by 27, and I'll hit equals. When you do that, you should get 44.7 degrees. Remember, if for some reason our answers are not matching, double check that the calculator's in degrees, so the degree part has to be darkened. If you need to see a couple more, we're going to follow the same steps. So this side is opposite because it's across from the angle. This side's hypotenuse because it's across from the right angle. The third side we call adjacent. Since I have O and H, that's sine inverse still, so I have sine inverse, opposite goes in the numerator, hypotenuse goes in the denominator. When I type this into the calculator, I'm pressing the inverse button, sine inverse. It's going to show up as arc sine 34 divided by 55. And for this one, you should get 38.18, which would round to 38.2 degrees. In these three examples, we used sine every time. Just remember, it depends on what sides are labeled, which formula you'd be using. So if I have opposite and hypotenuse, that means to use sine. If I have adjacent and hypotenuse, that means to use cosine. And if I have opposite and adjacent, that means to use tangent. So just make sure you're paying attention to which two sides you are given.